I never thought a single night could blur the lines between right and wrong, but that's exactly what happened. It was late, almost past midnight, and the house was cloaked in silence except for the faint hum of the air conditioner I had just turned off. My phone, after scrolling mindlessly, trying to shake off the heavy thoughts that had been bothering me for weeks. Dad had been distant lately. His work trips were getting longer, his patients shorter, and the house felt emptier even when he was here. Emma, my stepmom, was the only one who tried to keep things normal. She'd laugh at his tired jokes, make small talk during dinners, and act like everything was fine, but I could see it in her eyes. Something wasn't fine. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was just how families drifted apart. I had almost dozed off when I heard the softest knock at my door. So faint it could have been imagined. But then it came again, more deliberate this time. "Yeah," I called out, sitting up. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Emma stood there, her face illuminated by the dim hallway light. She was in her nightgown, a simple thing, but it clung to her in a way that made me look away quickly. "Caleb," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Were you asleep?" "No, not really," I replied, rubbing my eyes, trying to sound normal. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated, her hand lingering on the door knob for a moment. It looked like she might turn around, but then she stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. "I just needed someone to talk to," she said, her voice breaking slightly. I frowned. Did something happen? Her eyes glistened as she moved closer, sitting down on the edge of my bed. "I don't know how to say this without sounding crazy," she began, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Say what?" I asked, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't understand. "It's your dad," she said finally, looking down. "Lately, it feels like I'm invisible to him, like I'm just there, filling space." I didn't know what to say to that. This was my dad she was talking about, but it wasn't like I hadn't noticed the cracks in their relationship. "I'm sure he doesn't mean to make you feel like that," I offered, unsure if I even believed it myself. Emma shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "You're sweet, Caleb, but there are some things you can't just fix." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that made my chest tighten, vulnerability, loneliness, and something else I couldn't name. "Sorry," she said, shaking her head. "I shouldn't have bothered you with this." She started to stand, but I reached out without thinking, my hand brushing hers. "You're not bothering me," I said quickly. "Really?" She paused, her eyes locked on mine. The air between us felt charged, like something unsaid was lingering there, waiting to be acknowledged. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, she leaned in, her hand resting on my shoulder. It wasn't much, just a moment of closeness, but it felt like the world tilted. I could feel her breath warm against my skin, and my mind screamed at me to move, to say something, to do anything, but I didn't. The sound of a door creaking open in the hallway made us both freeze. Our heads turned sharply toward the door, and for a terrifying second, I thought it was Dad. Emma pulled back immediately, her hand slipping away from my shoulder like she'd just touched something burning her. Her wide eyes darted to the door, and for a moment, neither of us moved. My pulse thundered in my ears as the faint sound of footsteps passed by, heading toward the kitchen. "It's probably just him getting water," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She nodded but didn't relax. Her breathing was uneven, and her fingers trembled as she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I shouldn't be here," she said under her breath, standing up quickly. Emma, wait. I started, but she shook her head, already halfway to the door. Go to sleep, Caleb, she said, her voice firmer now, though her hand still shook as she opened the door just enough to slip out. She closed it behind her with a soft click, leaving me alone with the weight of what had just happened. I stared at the door for a long time, my thoughts racing. What was that? What had almost happened, and why hadn't I stopped her sooner? The silence of the house returned, but it felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to lie back down, but sleep was impossible. My mind kept replaying the way she'd looked at me, the way her voice had trembled. When she spoke, I sat up again, running a hand through my hair. This wasn't right. She was my stepmom, my dad's wife, and yet there was a part of me, some dark, unspoken part, that couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if those footsteps hadn't interrupted us. Minutes turned into an hour, maybe more, and I finally decided to get up. The air in my room felt suffocating, and I needed to clear my head. I walked out into the hallway, careful not to make any noise, and headed toward the kitchen. The light above the sink was on, casting a soft glow over the counters. Emma was there, standing by the window with a glass of water in her hand. She didn't notice me at first, her gaze fixed on something outside. Couldn't sleep either. I said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She jumped slightly but relaxed when she saw me. No, she admitted, setting the glass down on the counter. I've been thinking too much. Me too, I replied, stepping closer. Her eyes flicked to mine, and there it was again, that unspoken tension. It hung between us like a thread, fragile but impossible to ignore. Caleb, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't, we shouldn't. I know, I interrupted, though the words felt hollow. But what? She asked, cutting me off. There was frustration in her tone now, but also desperation. This is wrong, Caleb. It's so wrong. Then why does it feel like this? I shot back before I could stop myself. Her breath hitched, and for a second I thought she might cry. Instead, she looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. I don't know, she said finally. I wish I did. I should have walked away. I should have said good night and gone back to my room, but I didn't. I moved closer, close enough to see the way her hand shook, close enough to hear the unsteadiness of her breathing. You're not happy with him, I said quietly, the words spilling out before I could think them through. I can see it, she replied, her voice breaking. That doesn't make this okay. No, it doesn't, I admitted, but it's the truth, isn't it? She turned to face me then, and the look in her eyes was almost unbearable. Pain, guilt, and something else, something that made my heart pound. I don't know what to do anymore, she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. Neither of us noticed the faint shuffle of footsteps until it was too late. The sound of Dad's voice, groggy but sharp, broke the moment like a shard of glass. Emma, what are you doing up? He called from the hallway. The tension hit like a thunderclap. Emma's eyes widened, and she stiffened as Dad's voice grew closer. Without thinking, I stepped back into the shadows of the kitchen, pressing myself against the wall where I couldn't be seen. Emma turned toward the hallway, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes as Dad entered. His hair was disheveled, his movements sluggish. He glanced at her, then at the glass of water on the counter. Couldn't sleep, she said quickly, her voice calm, but distant. Dad scratched his head, yawning. You too? Long day, I guess. He moved past her toward the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. You coming back to bed? She hesitated, glancing briefly in my direction. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure Dad could hear it. In a minute, she finally said, I just need a moment. He grunted in response, clearly too tired to notice the strain in her voice. He trudged back down the hallway, his footsteps fading until the bedroom door closed behind him. Emma let out a shaky breath, her hand gripping the counter for support. Slowly, I stepped out of the shadows, and she turned to me, her face pale and unreadable. This has to stop, she whispered, her voice shaking. It's too dangerous. I wanted to argue, to say something that would make sense of the chaos between us, but before I could, she held up a hand. Go back to your room, Caleb, she said, her tone firmer now. And don't come out again tonight. Reluctantly, I nodded, knowing she was right. I slipped back into the hallway and returned to my room, shutting the door quietly behind me. But sleep didn't come. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, and guilt twisted in my chest like a knife. The next morning, the house felt different. Dad was back to his usual self, reading the paper at the breakfast table while Emma moved around the kitchen like nothing had happened. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided meeting my eyes. Morning, Dad, I said, glancing at him as I sat down. You sleep okay? Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. Emma placed a plate of toast in front of him, her hand brushing his shoulder briefly. It was a simple gesture, but the guilt in her eyes when she glanced at me made my stomach churn. I need to head into the office early today, Dad said, taking a bite of his toast. Can you pick up some groceries while I'm out? Of course, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the undercurrent of tension. An hour later, the house was empty except for the two of us. The silence was suffocating as I stood in the living room, unsure of what to say or do. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice low and measured. Caleb, we need to talk. I turned to face her, and the expression on her face stopped me in my tracks. She looked exhausted, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. What happened last night? She began, pausing to collect her thoughts. It can't happen again. It was a mistake. It didn't feel like a mistake, I said quietly, unable to stop myself. Her jaw tightened, and she took a step closer, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and desperation. It was wrong, Caleb, no matter how it felt. We can't. Before she could finish, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut her off. Her face went pale, and she glanced toward the window. That's not possible, she whispered. He said he wouldn't be back until evening. The car door slammed, and footsteps approached the front door. Emma grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Go upstairs now. I hesitated, but the panic in her voice spurred me into action. I ran up the stairs just as the front door opened, and from the landing I could hear Dad's voice. Sharp, angry, and nothing like the calm tone he'd had earlier that morning. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. I couldn't hear Emma's response, but whatever she said didn't seem to calm him down. The tension in the air was unbearable, and then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps on the stairs. Dad was coming up, and he was heading straight for my room. My heart raced as I backed away from the door, the realization hitting me like a freight train. He knew. Somehow he knew. The door swung open, and Dad stood there, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. What's going on between you and Emma? He demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And then Emma appeared behind him, her face pale and stricken. Richard, stop, she pleaded, her voice breaking. It's not what you think. But it was too late. The truth was written all over our faces. And there was no going back. You think I'm blind? Dad shouted, his voice echoing through the house. You think I haven't noticed the way you look at each other? The way she avoids me? Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. And in that moment, everything fell apart. Dad stormed out of the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate as he headed for the door. Emma followed him, begging him to listen, but I knew it was useless. The damage was done. As the front door slammed shut, the house fell into an eerie silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, the weight of my actions crashing down on me. This wasn't how it was supposed to end, but maybe deep down I'd always known it couldn't end any other way. Days turned into weeks, but the house never felt the same. Dad moved out the very next morning, leaving behind only a cold silence and a hurriedly packed suitcase. Emma barely spoke to me. Her once warm and caring demeanor was replaced by an uneasy tension that lingered in every room. We avoided each other as much as possible, but the moments we crossed paths were filled with stolen glances and unsaid words. One evening, as I sat on the couch flipping through channels, she walked into the living room, her expression unreadable. She didn't sit, just stood there, her arms crossed as if deciding whether to say what was on her mind. Finally, she broke the silence. He's filing for divorce, she said, her voice quiet but heavy with emotion. I turned off the TV and looked at her, unsure of what to say. Because of us, she said. Because of me, she corrected, her gaze dropping to the floor. He couldn't forgive me, Caleb, and honestly, I don't blame him. Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but there was no time to process them. She walked toward the kitchen, leaving me sitting there, grappling with the reality of what we'd done. Later that night, I heard soft sobs coming from her bedroom. I wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gotten here. A few days later, Emma decided to leave the house. I can't stay here anymore, she told me, her voice steady but her eyes filled with sadness. It's too much. I wanted to ask her to stay, to tell her we could figure things out together, but deep down I knew she was right. Staying here in this house that held so many broken pieces of our lives wasn't an option anymore. The morning she left, the house felt emptier than ever. She hugged me briefly at the door, her touch lingering just a second too long. Take care of yourself, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You too, I replied, watching as she walked down the driveway and got into her car. She didn't look back for a while. I tried to move on. I buried myself in work, spent more time with friends, and avoided coming home until I absolutely had to. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of her, of us. One night months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop when I saw her. She was sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, staring out at the street. She looked different, happier, lighter. I almost didn't approach her, but something inside me couldn't resist. I walked over, and when she looked up and saw me, her expression softened. Caleb, she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. Hi, I said, sitting down across from her. We talked for hours, catching up on everything we'd missed. She told me about her new life in a different city, her job, and the small apartment she'd made her own. I've been trying to move on, she admitted, her eyes meeting mine. But some things, some people are hard to forget. I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that the pull between us hadn't gone away. It was still there, as strong as ever. As the night wore on, we both knew We were standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything again. When we finally left the coffee shop, the air between us crackled with unspoken possibilities. She hesitated at her car, her keys in hand, before turning to face me. "This can't happen again," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I stepped closer, unable to stop myself. "Then tell me you don't feel it anymore. Tell me it's over." She didn't respond. Instead, she closed the distance between us, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and desperate. And just like that, we were right back where we started, caught in a web of desire, guilt, and choices that had no easy answers. Weeks after that night at the coffee shop, the reality of our choices began to settle in. Emma and I had shared moments that felt like stolen fragments of a dream, but reality always crept in, reminding us of everything we'd broken. One evening, I received a call from my dad. It was the first time we'd spoken since he moved out. His voice was calmer than I expected, but every word carried the weight of unspoken pain. "Caleb," he began, "I'm selling the house." I wasn't surprised, but the finality of his words hit hard. "I understand," I said quietly. "I need you to clear out your things," he added. "The realtor will start showing it next week." The thought of packing up and leaving felt like closing the last chapter of a book I wasn't ready to finish, but I agreed. When I went back to the house, it felt different, cold, hollow, like a shell of what it used to be. The walls seemed to echo with memories, both good and bad. As I packed, I found little reminders of Emma everywhere. A scarf she'd left on the couch, the faint trace of her perfume on the pillows. Just as I was about to leave, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart skipped a beat when I looked out the window and saw her stepping out. "I heard about the house," she said, standing in the doorway. I thought I should come by one last time." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside her. We walked through the house together, silent at first, letting the memories wash over us. "This place was never really a home for me," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "But you made it feel like one." I didn't know how to respond, so I just stood there, letting her words hang in the air. Finally, I asked the question that had been eating away at me for months. "Do you regret it?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I regret hurting your dad," she said softly. "I regret the pain we caused. But us, what we had, I can't bring myself to regret that." Her honesty was like a punch to the chest, but it also brought a strange sense of closure. For the first time, I felt like we were both facing the truth of what we'd done, without excuses or denials. As we stood in the empty living room, the weight of everything we'd been through seemed to press down on us. She reached out, her fingers grazing mine, but this time I pulled back. "I think we both know this has to end," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling. "It's time to let go." We stood there for a long moment, neither of us wanting to be the first to leave. Finally, she turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the house that had been the backdrop to so much of our story. As I locked the door for the last time, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The chapter was over, but the scars it left behind would stay with me forever. Life moved on after that. Emma and I didn't see each other again, and I heard through mutual friends that she had moved far away, starting fresh in a new city. Dad and I eventually began to rebuild our relationship, though it was never quite the same. Sometimes late at night, I'd catch myself thinking about her, about the woman who had turned my life upside down and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. But in the end, I knew one thing for certain. Some chapters are meant to close, no matter how much they hurt.